Welcome viewers to MOOC's online course on Introduction to Indian Art and Appreciation. This is the fourth module of our last week where we are discussing the tradition to modernity, the journey from tradition to modernity in the context of Indian art. Now in the last module we discussed how a group of artists driven by a certain nationalist sentiment reacted against the colonial system of art practice within India, and as a result they came up with some brilliant artworks reflecting the need, the desire, the dream of creating an alternative art language, an alternative art form different from what the colonial rulers were expecting from us. Today, in the module 4, we will be looking at the different attempts, the different thoughts, the different ways of looking at art practice in the post-independent India. Now, we need to remember that post-independent India, that is post-1947, the history of that period did not begin with all that glory. I mean, despite the fact that it was a momentous thing to happen in the history of India. India was ultimately free from the colonial rulers, 15th August 1947. Yet there were a lot of things happening which disturbing things were happening which disturbed the Indian people. For example, in 1943 there was this famine leaving thousands and thousands of people impoverished, hungry, and many of them perished just out of hunger. We also remember that 1947, along with the independence due to a very fruitful, very successful freedom movement, there was also this migration, almost let us say a forced migration known as the infamous partition of India, 1947, leaving thousands of people to migrate from this part of the land to that part of the land. So politically, socially, and otherwise also, there was a certain kind of disturbance. But in spite of all these disturbances, post-independent India also witnessed an extraordinary urge within the people, and particularly cultural activists like writers, poets, artists, musicians, performers, to create a vision, a dream of India which will help in the nation building activities, because post independence also means there is a huge amount of responsibility on Indian people to build up the nation gradually. And as you know, when you build up a nation economically and education wise, health wise, culture plays a very important role in this entire process. And it is in this cultural field that visual art left a very important contribution. It's a post-independent era. But post-independent era was also witnessing, as I just mentioned, the continuation of the impact of certain disturbing moments like famine and partition, and artists like Zainul Abidin, Chitra Prasad, and later Somnath Hor, who have been responding and reacting to these incidents in their artworks. They also, by virtue of the response, by virtue of their commitment to a certain kind of society, commitment towards a certain kind of cause, they also came up with an art language which is undoubtedly realistic. There is no question about that, but at the same time, they also developed a style of drawing and painting which could be very expressive also. Because you see, this is very important, because during the colonial period and in the context of the company painting, the brand of realism that developed, visual realism, it was almost neutral. There was a kind of neutrality. You are not supposed to be emotionally engaged with what you are visually recording. But here, artists like Zainul Abidin, Chitta Prasad, Somnath Hoare, they were not neutral and emotionless observer. They were emotional artists. They were observing certain degrading and extremely disturbing and annoying circumstances of life with a very strong emotion, a very strong mindset, and as a result, their artworks like this one is not just a visual record of a dying man, not just simply a drawing, a faithful drawing of an impoverished, suffering man, but it is the suffering itself which is the main content of the painting or the drawing. It has to be very expressive. It has to be full of emotional content. So this is the contribution of these people who responded to very disturbing events like the famine of 1943, the partition of 1947, and all those political turmoils on the eve of 1947 independence of India, because their responses in a way paved way to a very expressive art language, which in turn would help the Indian artists to move towards developing a modern Indian art. And these people like Somnath Hoare, they not only excelled in drawing and painting and printmaking, but also in sculpture. So, in various kinds of mediums, these artists began their practice, because whereas one of their aims was to help the nation building process through their artwork, another aim was also to make their art internationally known. This international acceptance, this global acceptance was definitely an important agenda that was shaping their mind. So, this would result in a practice wherein the artists would not only be looking at our own past and heritage and Indian traditional elements, but they would also be looking very carefully and studying the developments, the current developments taking place in the modern Western art. Not that they were trying to blend this with that, but this whole awareness of the global scenario is a very important aspect of the post-independent modern Indian art. It was also a very important aspect of the post-independent Indian nation. India also made all kinds of efforts so that its presence can be felt globally. It was under the British rule for several years, several decades, almost more than 2 centuries. They have had enough. Now they want to, Indians want to be known as an independent nation and potentially powerful, to be self-sufficient, to be useful, and to be important in every sphere of life. So we have people like Paritoshin, for example, who lived through the turmoils of partition and independence, but eventually also tried to build up a language, a pictorial language, which would rightly express the spirit of the post-independent India. Now, in other words, post-independent Indian art does not necessarily mean that all these artists had a singular agenda. No. It only means, in fact, if you look at the entire range, in one single module we won't be able to see many, maybe just a few artists and few artworks. But if you study yourself and look at the entire range of the post-independent modern Indian art, you will be amazed to see the variety of styles, the entire range of aesthetics, the pictorial languages, different kinds of idioms used by different artists. Now, this is because variety was not an issue. I mean, there was no problem having a lot of variations in their art language and expressions. The issue was that there should be a global awareness of what we are doing. The issue was that our art practice should become at par with the nation building activity of the newly independent India. Because you see, as far as the global awareness is concerned, way back in 1922, Rabindranath had already invited a Viennese art historian, Stella Kramrisch, to Shantiniketan and requested her to deliver a series of lectures on modern Western art. So, even Tagore was also very conscious about this global and international awareness of cultural scenario. So, you have somebody like Kishan Khanna from Bombay doing a lot of artworks wherein the people the figures painted here are known to him, familiar people. Sometimes it also do something based on a motif drawn from a religious world or a religious thought. But what is interesting in all these figurative works is that the painters are trying to experiment and explore the possibilities of human body. Human body, in other words, is becoming the central motif in most of the post-independent art. Though in a place like Shantiniketan, even after independence, in 40s, 50s, 60s, landscape, nature was still a very strong subject matter. But post-independent art in the urban centers like Calcutta, Bombay, there we see the artists are looking at human figures as potential areas to express their feelings, personal feelings, individual feelings, social feelings, and also shared feelings. Now, within this framework, we also have an artist like Raza, who completely devoted himself to abstract art. Throughout his life, he explored and experimented with the possibilities of abstraction, but it is not a kind of modern Western art abstract. Raza's abstract art is very much rooted in the Indian ethos, Indian philosophy, Indian aesthetics of abstraction. In fact, many of his abstract paintings have very typically Indian name like Bindu. Bindu is the name of not one of his paintings, but series of paintings, many paintings. And he develops on this idea of Bindu, this idea of the dot, the circle. Since the entire thought process is very abstract, his paintings are also very abstract. This is one more by the same artist, Raza, again by Raza. So, it is interesting that in this context, wherein the other artists are working vigorously to develop on the idea of the body, to explore the possibilities of human figure. Here you have one artist, Raza from Bombay, who was drawn to the possibilities of abstraction right from the late 40s. One more by Raza. Souza was another artist from Bombay who should also be considered as a very important post-independent modern Indian artist. Not just because of his subject, but because of his form, subject matter, and also his method of doing a painting, which is very unconventional, which may have some connections with certain European tradition, but overall Souza was very much rooted to his individual psychological sensibilities, which was the source of many of his paintings. Then of course we have this towering figure in the post-independent modern Indian art, Hussain, M.F. Hussain, Maqbool Fida Hussain. If we are talking about post-independent modern Indian art in the context of the building of a new nation, then Hussain should be our poster boy. He is the face of that nation building activity from the visual, cultural aspect. In fact, Hussain was not only creating a new form of modern art, he was also creating a new audience for modern Indian art. Because after all, as the saying goes, art ceases to exist if you do not have an audience. And Indian audience were so far interested mostly in what was traditional or pseudo-traditional. But now Indian artists are more interested in doing something more contemporary, something more modern, something that would echo the ethos of the current society, the current time. But where is that audience? So Hussain created art which is stylistically difficult to build, to paint. Even in terms of technique, Hussain's way of doing oil painting and drawing is not easy. He was a very skillful artist, no doubt about that. His skill, his dexterity is mind-boggling. Yet, compared to what you see in a painting by Souza or Raza, Hussain's paintings are easier in the sense that when you look at the subject matter, when you look at the motifs, even if the motifs are very distorted, the horses look very elongated, the male and female figures look a bit distorted, it does not matter. Anybody, almost any common person, common viewer can relate to, at least can respond to Hussain's painting. Not that Hussain's paintings are easy, but Hussain's paintings in terms of the motifs, in terms of its composition are comfortable for the audience to respond. In other words, Hussain was very successful in creating a whole generation of art audience, art viewers, because of his popularity and also because of the fact that he deliberately never tried to make his art very difficult to understand or even difficult to view. And then of course, he often used very well known popular motifs like Mother Teresa, like Tagore, like Satyajit Ray, and very well known motifs from our popular culture in order to make his art also not just easier, but to create a bridge between his art and the audience through the culture. In order to make this statement felt that he is not making art only for an elitist group of people like collectors and gallerists. His art has that power, has that uncanny power which empowers everybody to look, to feel, to enjoy. So despite the fact that Hussain, like most of the artists who have lived long and worked throughout his life, may not have always been very consistent in terms of his quality. I believe in every artist there are always these ups and downs. That is not the issue, but the point is that being a very prolific painter, he has been able to continuously explore this possibility of making art more tangible, more understandable, more appreciable from the common viewers, from the common people. And also his art was extremely supportive of the idea, of the dream of a new nation that most of the Indian people were envisaging. So this is one painting called Zameen, is an evidence of how Hussain's idea of a new independent nation, that is India, completely merges very well or reflects and supports the idea of nation that is shared by everybody, by the political leaders, by the common people, by the nation at large. This is not to say that Hussain was a nationalist painter in the sense some of these painters like Abanindranath Tagore and others were during the British period. It is to say that Hussain was successfully responding to his time, to the ethos of his time. Then similarly we also have another artist contemporary to Hussain called Taib Mehta from Mumbai again. In fact, Taib Mehta's distortion of forms, the way he experimented with the anatomy, these distortions created a new style, a very powerful style to deal with the human body, and that made his paintings look very contemporary, very modern in every possible way. Then we also have another towering figure in the context of modern Indian art of post-40s, post-independence, called K.G. Subramanian, who passed away last month. Now, Subramanian in a way is his modernity or his contemporaneity lies in the fact, beside others, the fact that he was extremely versatile. He was versatile in every possible medium. This is also a way to break the traditional notion of that one particular artist is skilled in one particular medium. So this specialization aspect, this idea of being a specialist in one particular medium is completely ignored and ruled out by a very versatile artist like K.G. Subramanian. And because of the whole nature of his art, which is very well constructed, very well structured, very well textured, and definitely very colorful, with lot of play with form, color, drawing, etc. Many of his works are also very funny. I mean, there is an element of fun, there is an element of playfulness, and you remember this idea of playfulness was very pertinent when we discussed Indian folk art, because in most of the examples of Indian folk art we find that playfulness is not only a quality, it is also a driving force. And it is not a coincidence that K.G. Subramanian drew his inspiration, a lot of it actually, from Indian folk art traditions. So almost as a natural phenomenon, in Subramanian's works also you find this playful quality, which is not only playful in terms of its figuration and color juxtaposition and formal organization, it is also playful in terms of the subject matter, in terms of the content. And that is why Subramanian often can be very sarcastic, very witty. Some of his humors in his paintings are very sardonic. It is possible because a modern artist like him is out of the shackles of either traditional art or the colonial art. He is free to invent and innovate, and that is what he has done throughout his life, to the extent that he has also played with Indian mythology, not with irreverence but with love, with this playful quality. Almost like the way the Indian folk artists have also played with Indian mythology. Now we have also slightly later somebody like Bikash Bhattacharya, an artist who lived and worked in Kolkata. Bikash Bhattacharya is a typically post-independent modern Indian artist who deliberately made an urban environment a very strong element in his paintings, not subtly but very directly. He also used a realistic language of painting, and his people, his environment, his composition is extremely urban, but not the very contemporary, very new urban, slightly an old urban setup, relating himself with the place where he lived and worked, that is North Calcutta, old North Calcutta. So it is also very interesting that at the hands of these people like Bikash Bhattacharya, a new urban modern Indian art is taking shape. We can take note of this. Then like Hussain, he has also used, Bikash Bhattacharya also has used Mother Teresa as a motif of compassion, motif of suffering, motif of empathy. But you can make a beautiful comparison between these two paintings, the painting where you see Hussain using Mother Teresa and this painting where Bikash Bhattacharya is also using Mother Teresa, but in a slightly different way. A comparison would be very interesting. And within this urban setup, within this urban psychological kind of feelings, Bikash Bhattacharya was also a very powerful artist when he does this kind of surrealistic paintings, where the entire painting looks a little uncanny, little magical, little eerie also, but at the same time it evokes all those fears and anxieties that a modern society carries within itself. And one of his most famous series of paintings is known as the Doll series. You may have a look at his Doll series later on and see how the urban dream, the urban life has been addressed in his paintings, but not necessarily to please us, not necessarily to give us a very comfortable feeling, but rather Bikash Bhattacharya's paintings evoke a sense of not fear exactly, but a sense of uneasiness, a discomfort. Probably that is also a very important quality in modern Indian art, a sense of discomfort, which would be later taken up by one of his contemporaries, Jogin Chaudhuri, in his drawings and paintings, where the body itself looks very discomfort, a discomfortable body. Though the man here does not seem to be very discomfortable with his own body, but we feel discomfortable. So, a certain kind of discomfort combined with a sense of humor and a sarcasm and also fear is what many of these artists like Bikash Bhattacharya, Jogin Chaudhuri, previously K.G. Subramanian were looking for, and trying to create a new opening of modern Indian art for the next generations as well. So, even one single drawing of a head of an unknown person by Jogin Chaudhuri could be so enchanting without anything else in it. Still, you can keep looking at it for hours and feel the passion, feel what this particular image provokes you to think, feel, and even relate, and even imagine. I mean, after all, at the end of it, when you keep looking at this image for a while, you feel this is not a face that is going to keep you in comfort. So, deliberately keeping you in some discomfort, some kind of uneasiness is what many of these artists are trying to do. And then finally, after Jogen Chaudhary, not chronologically after, he was a couple of years senior to him, we also have a very famous well-known artist from that period called Ganesh Pine. As an example I am taking, there were many others also. Ganesh Pine also is no more, but he has left behind hundreds of wonderful paintings done very, very delicately using the watercolor techniques used by or followed by artists like Abanindranath Tagore, even the miniaturists, the miniature painters before. But instead of once again creating a world of pleasure, what Ganesh Pine does here, he creates a world of pensive, thoughtful mood and almost intangible. Though compared to his paintings, Bikash Bhattacharya's paintings look more tangible, more palpable. But Ganesh Pine's paintings, despite the fact that you can identify, well, this is a figure, this is a wall, this is a lamp, this is a furniture, this is a cloth. So, there is no problem in identifying what has been shown in the paintings. Yet, the mood that is created is deeply disturbing or very pensive or maybe melancholic. Now, how do you read that is up to you. And this is how at every sphere of our existence, art is becoming a very important expression, not only for the artists, but also for the new generation of art audience in post-independent India. They know that the function of art is not restricted only to any particular objective. It can be highly individualistic, it can be deeply psychological, at the same time it can be very social, it can be very outward, it can be very introvert. All these possibilities were opened up, like taking them out from a Pandora's box during this period after 1947. And these are only the few artists that we have discussed today, very few, but there are a lot more, which you can search and look at their works to get a broader and a better view of this entire period of post 1947. But before we move on to our next module, where we will be talking more about some of the very contemporary trends in modern Indian art, let us look at this painting and try to analyze whether it makes any sense to you or not. If it does, please explain what. If it doesn't, again, please explain to yourself why it doesn't make any sense. After all, this is one painting where it seems the artist is confronting death. What kind of death he is indicating? With this very pensive, very brooding question, I wind up today's module. Thank you.